All right, so the first problem that we have the square root of x plus 1 is equal to 3. And so since the x is inside the square root, we have to get it out of the square root symbol before we can do anything else. So what's the opposite of square rooting something?
Squaring.
And what we do to one side, we have to do the other. So the square root of x plus 1 squared is just x plus 1. 3 squared is 9. So, well, obviously, subtract 1, and we get x is equal to 8.
Bueno.
Okay, that's enough. So that one really isn't too bad. So let's look at one that's slightly more complicated. This time, we have a plus 2 that is not inside the square root. Well, we could square the whole thing, but if we square the whole thing, we would get this nastiness. And if we were to multiply that out, we would get a really ugly irrational number, so that doesn't help. And as you very astutely pointed out, let's subtract 2. So we get the square root of 4x is equal to 4. Well, what's the opposite of square rooting? Squaring. So the square root of 4x squared is 4x. 4 squared is? So what's the opposite of multiplying x by 4? So let's divide by 4, divide by 4. So x is equal to?
4.
Oh, again, not too bad. Well, here we have another problem that is of equal complexity, but instead of adding something, we are multiplying something to our square root. And we know we need to get that term with the square root by itself before we can square it. So what's the opposite of multiplying by 4?
Dividing by 4.
So let's divide everything by 4. So we get 13 is equal to the square root of 2x. So what's the opposite of square rooting? Squaring. So let's go ahead and square this. 13 squared is 169, which is equal to 2x. What's the opposite of multiplying by 2?
Dividing by 2.
So we get x is equal to 84.5. So it looks worse than it really is. Now, in this case, we have square roots on both sides. But this square root has our variable t. So really, we're trying to isolate this variable. So at the moment, we're multiplying it by 5. What's the opposite of multiplying by 5? So let's divide both sides by 5. So we get 3 root 2 is equal to root t. What's the opposite of taking the square root of t?
Squaring.
Oh, okay, so let's square this. Let's square this. So the square root of t squared is? 3 root 2 times 3 root 2. 3 times 3 is?
9.
Root 2 times root 2 is?
2.
So 9 times 2 is?
11.
So t is equal to 18. Okay. So we did 3 times 3 is 9. Root 2 times root 2 is 2. All right, now things can be a little more complex. So the first 4 problems we were only dealing with linear relationships. Now we have a quadratic term. So we have to think back to our lives with factoring, because that's going to come back again. But the process remains the same. We have the g inside the square root, and it's being multiplied by 2. So what am I going to do to both sides to get the? Okay. So divide by 2, divide by 2. So I get 5 is equal to the square root of 3g squared minus 2. Well, what's the opposite of square rooting?
Squaring.
Squared. So 5 squared is?
25.
So we get 25 is equal to
3g to the
3g squared minus 2. All right, well, what's the opposite of subtracting 2? So let's add 2. Plus 2 plus 2. And so we get 27 is equal to 3g squared. What's the opposite of multiplying g squared by 3? Dividing. So let's divide by 3. Let's divide by 3. And so we get 9 is equal to g squared. So what's the opposite of squaring?
Anti-squaring.
Now, this is where you're going to have to be a little bit careful. What times what is 9?
3.
Okay, so g clearly equals 3, but is there another number multiplied by itself that is also equal to 9? Abby? Negative 3. So this is a quadratic, so there's a possibility of having two answers. In this case, we have 3 and negative 3, because negative 3 squared is in fact 9. So that's why there are two answers. And that makes sense because you know a quadratic has a graph that is a parabola that crosses the x-axis twice, so there are two answers. All right. Finally, this last one. This one I'm going to solve using factoring. Just a little heads up. So what's the opposite of square rooting this thing?
Squaring.
So we're going to square both sides. So clearly we get 3w squared minus 32 is equal to w squared. Well, what am I going to do to both sides to get the w squareds together? No.
You could just subtract w squared.
Let's subtract w squared. What I do to one side, I do to the other. So 3w squared minus w squared is 2w squared is equal, minus 32 is equal to 0. You can have a 0 there, that's okay. All right. So then, if I'm factoring, what's the first form of factoring that I look for?
Addition and subtraction.
Greatest common monomial. So what goes into 2 and negative 32? 2. So we know that we have a 2 and we have g squared, sorry, w, I'm stuck on the other problem. We have w squared minus 16 is equal to 0. Oh my goodness. W squared minus 16, what is that?
I do believe that's 4.
It's a difference of squares. So, go ahead.
W minus 4.
So we get w minus 4 times
Plus 4.
w plus 4 equals 0. So what would make this binomial 0?
Positive 4.
Positive 4. What would make this binomial 0?
Negative 4.
And this is why you get two answers in this problem as well. So w is equal to 4 and negative 4.
No. Let's go, Clay.
Yeah, there's another way to do it.